Hi, Martin.
Hi, how are you, Roman?
Nice to meet you. Is
Nice to meet you.
Dominic here? Dominic, where are you? We'll wait and perhaps another minute for Dominic.
I see him up there.
Yeah, he's here, but I'd ask him to open his camera. All right, guys, let's start this session. Well, okay, so this second session today consists of two quite different presentations. So I'd prefer to take questions for every presentation after it. We'll start from the first presenter, Martin Feshball. He's an associate professor of English and chair of the School of Arts and Humanities at Black Hills State University in Spearfish, South Dakota. He specializes in Romantic and Victorian British literature and has published articles on Percy Bysshe Shelley, Robert Browning, George Meredith, and Robert Louis Stevenson. Martin has a forthcoming article that will be published this fall in Poetica, which is an examination of the importance of jealousy and resentment in the narrative dynamics of the verse novel. Today's paper will be Martin's first piece of scholarship on modernist literary work. And his presentation is called Gabriel's Epiphany and the End of Resentment, a religious and nationalistic feeling in James Joyce's The Dead. Right, Martin?
Thank you, Roman, and it's very nice to be back at this conference. So yes, this is the first time I am writing. I have written a paper on something other than 19th century British literature. So wish me luck, everyone. How many of you are familiar with James Joyce's The Dead? James Joyce's The Dead. That was a work. Well, James Joyce published it in The Dubliners, so it's a collection of wonderful short stories, and it's the last so-called short story. It's a borderline novella in The Dubliners, and not much seems to be going on in that short story until around the last third or quarter of the piece. Well, lots going on actually, but Gabriel Conroy, who's the main character in the story, and his wife Greta are invited to this annual party hosted by Julia and Kate Morgan, and there's a lot of fun and frivolity, music, dancing, that kind of thing. And Gabriel has to give this speech, as he always does, and he's like, overwrought with anxiety about that. He has some awkward encounters with a couple women. He doesn't know whether or not he should read from Robert Browning in his speech, and he ends up scrapping Robert Browning. He gives a really, really successful speech, I would say, but that's when the story really begins, because as they're packing up early in the early morning hours and getting ready to go to their hotel overnight, his wife is entranced by this song that is sung. And I'll leave it there, and just to give you a little context. Okay. James Joyce's The Dead, which is the last story in The Dubliners, ends with the middle-aged and learned protagonist, Gabriel Conroy, staring out his hotel window and imagining the entirety of Ireland enveloped in snow. He mentally traverses the Bog of Allen, the Shannon waves, quote, every part of the dark central plain, the treeless hills, and finally, quote, every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Furry lie buried. Gabriel has just learned after a Christmas party that Fury was a young man whom his wife Greta loved and who died after risking his frail health by running in the rain to see Greta one last time before she moved east. After Greta tells the story, Gabriel succumbs to jealousy and anger because he realizes that she never loved him as she loved Fury. However, after Greta falls asleep, Gabriel's rage diminishes and the character begins to gain a more objective view of the experience. He escapes the prison of self-pity by imaginatively drifting away from his hotel chamber and out over various Irish landmarks, eventually settling over Michael Fury's grave in a churchyard somewhere in the west of Ireland. Gabriel's escape demonstrates Eric Ganz's concept of the deferral of violence through representation, I would argue. Of course, the violence Gabriel defers is not of the physical sort. It is not as if Greta should soon become concerned for her safety, now that she has revealed the secret that she has harbored for the duration of her marriage, nor Michael Fury, of course, because he has, of course, passed away a long time ago. However, Gabriel's muffled hostility would be damaging enough, for it would be add bitterness, resentment, and an increase in the emotional and psychological distance that has defined their marriage up to this point. One purpose of this essay is to show that Gabriel's renewed passion for Greta, which had been intensifying prior to her shocking revelation, is, as René Girard would characterize it, mimetic. More importantly, this essay examines how Gabriel defers this violence through the aborted gesture of appropriation, an act of deferment he sustains through imaginative flights of fancy. Furthermore, this paper argues that Gabriel's deferral of violence in favor of symbolic appropriation is a spiritual and religious event, for he symbolically appropriates not only Greta, but his rival Fury, and in fact, the whole of Ireland, creating this feeling of oneness and inseparability, which often grounds religious experience. Okay, part two. The gesture of appropriation and the eventual return to the scene starts, of course, with mimetic desire, and the first 2/3 of the story presents Gabriel as a self-conscious figure without revealing any mimetic rivalry that contributes to its self-consciousness. The mimetic desire begins to show itself after the party when the guests are preparing to depart and Greta stands in the middle of the staircase, entranced by the song, The Lass of Aughrim, sung by Bartel de Arcy. Here is how Joyce describes Gabriel's wife. Here's how Joyce describes Gabriel's reaction to his wife, whom he does not recognize at first, standing near the top of the steps, quote, in the shadow also, leaning on the banisters, listening to something. There was a grace and mystery in her attitude, as if she were a symbol of something. He asked himself, what is a woman standing on the stairs in the shadow, listening to distant music a symbol of? If he were a painter, he would paint her in the attitude. Her blue felt hat would show off the bronze of her hair against the darkness, and dark panels of her skirt would show off the light ones. Distant music, he would call the picture if he were a painter, end quote. It is reasonable to presume that the learned and erudite Gabriel has had plenty of experience viewing works of high visual art depicting women in such a manner. And so Gabriel is likely using an assortment of acclaimed painters as external mediators as opposed to internal mediators to serve as models for his artistic vision. It is also important to point out that Gabriel is simulating the aborted gesture of appropriation by, I emphasize simulating, by declaring her through the act of painting, imaginatively of course, as sacred. He immediately sees Greta, after all, as a symbol of something, a sign of her sacredness, and Gabriel therefore momentarily sees Greta as unobtainable. As Gans puts it, the beauty of the sign, its closure as a formal entity, reflects the renunciation of its original appetitive goal of attaining its object, which it represents, end quote. And while the sacralizing act is one of mimicry rather than sincerity, this rendering of Greta as a symbol nonetheless creates a sexual longing in Gabriel for her, or at least a romantic longing. As they are walking to the cab that will take them to their hotel, Joyce describes the nature of Gabriel's passion. Quote, the blood went bounding along his veins and the thoughts went rioting through his brain, proud, joyful, tender, valorous, end quote. Passion continues to manifest in intense feelings and images as they board the carriage and as they enter the hotel and make their way to their room. Quote, he longed to be alone with her when the others had gone away, when he and she were in the room in the hotel, then they would be alone together, end quote. It is interesting to note that none of this sexual feeling, this or romantic feeling comes from an actual conversation he is having with her. It is this painterly image she projects on the staircase and subsequent mysterious behavior that enlivens romantic interest in Greta, and he is anticipating actualizing his desire to make love to her. His imaginary act illustrates Gans's assertion that the aesthetic, quote, mobilizes our desires for both appetite of satisfaction and further abortive acts of appropriation, end quote. That's from the New Way of Thinking. This romantic desire to appropriate, stimulated by his aesthetic act of imagining a painting of Greta, is then transformed into anger when he learns the song that mesmerized his wife reminded her of an old beloved. Even though Fury is dead, a song has brought him back to life to become a rival to whom Gabriel feels inferior. Quote, Gabriel felt humiliated by the failure of his irony and by the evocation of this figure from the dead, a boy in the gasworks. While he had been full of memories of their secret life together, full of tenderness and joy and desire, she, Greta, had been comparing him in her mind with another. A shameful consciousness of his own person assailed him, end quote. Gabriel's focus of attention towards Greta has shifted to Fury, who is, oddly enough, an internal mediator to whom he feels inferior. This shift demonstrates Gerard's point that desire for the object is not as intense as a fascination with the rival, and this turn of attention toward the rival leads to feelings of inadequacy and this shameful consciousness. Joyce first directs our attention to the hatred and resentment that the competition with the rival brings. To remove these feelings of shame, Gabriel must now remove himself spiritually from the imagined center of conflict existing between Fury and himself. However, the renunciation he engages in will lead to much more than declaring Greta, the object of his desire, to be sacred. As someone who feels alienated not just from his wife, but as we learn earlier in the story, his country of Ireland's heritage and culture as well, the triangular scene between Gabriel, Greta, and himself is made into a sacred emblem of all humanity, or at least all Irish humanity. Part 3. Greta's deteriorating emotional control helps to persuade Gabriel to remove himself from the mimetic scene as she begins to narrate the story of her history with Fury. She informs Gabriel of the time one early winter when she was about to leave her grandmother's home in the west of Ireland to travel to Dublin. Within the tale's telling, she pauses to sigh, which is one of the first clues of how emotionally taxing the story it is for her to tell. She must then abandon her narration soon after getting to the part involving the night before she left for Dublin, with Fury standing in the rain outside Greta's grandmother's house and throwing gravel up against the window to get her attention. Quote, she stopped, choking with sobs, and, overcome by emotion, flung herself face downward on the bed, sobbing in the quilt, end quote. Up to this point, Gabriel has been asking questions that force Greta to continue with the story. However, Gabriel becomes shy of intruding on her grief, end quote, and walks away to peer out the window. His growing awareness of his wife's raw humanity makes him less assertive about acquiring additional facts concerning her early romance, let alone continuing his attempt to make love to her. Gabriel is also experiencing a growing empathy for Greta, which causes the resentment he has for her and Michael to dissipate as his focus shifts from his rival to Greta. After Greta falls asleep, Gabriel looks, quote, for a few moments unresentfully on her tangled hair and half-open mouth, listening to her deep-drawn breath. It hardly pained him now to think how poor a part he, her husband, had played in her life. His curious eyes rested long upon her face and hair, and he thought of what she must have been then, in the time of her first girlish beauty. A strange, friendly pity for her entered his soul, end quote. In sympathy for Greta in her most vulnerable state, Gabriel seemingly loses touch with his resentment and is no longer troubled by the self-conscious awareness that has been a poor, that the self-conscious awareness that he has been a poor, romantically challenged husband. This resentment, one would argue, is not disappearing, but is being transformed aesthetically into a series of visions that follow. Soon after Greta falls asleep, her revelations cause Gabriel first to imagine what Aunt Julia's deathbed scene might look like, and she is one of the hosts of the party, with Gabriel's useless words unable to console Aunt Kate. Gabriel has drawn a connection between his sexual impotence, or his brought on by Greta's revelation of her history with Fury, and his perceived inability to establish intimate connections with family and perhaps friends. Next, Gabriel's attention shifts once more to his wife in Fury. Greta, quote, had locked in her heart so many years that image of her lover's eyes when he had told her that he did not wish to live, end quote. Here, Gabriel is constructing an originary scene of desire involving himself, Greta, and Fury, but since the scene has already happened, of course, Gabriel has no recourse but to abort the pursuit of his wife in favor of the creation of the sign for this scene. Gabriel is now ready to leave the bitterness and resentment behind, at least temporarily, and transform the experience of hearing her story into images associated with Greta's past, as indicated in the story's next to last paragraph. Generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that. He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness, he imagined he saw the form of a young man standing under a dripping tree, Fury, of course. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead he was conscious of, but could not apprehend their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a gray, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead souls had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling, end quote. Here, Gabriel appropriates by reconstructing the scene of Greta's last encounter with Fury when he stands under the tree in the rain, rather than continuing to harbor rage over Greta's long harbored secret. Greta's slumber allows him to back away from further pursuit of the details into her romance with Fury, and instead transform the morbidly romantic scene from her past by assembling fresh mental images of it. Ironically, but understandably, these images make him love Greta perhaps more than he had ever loved her before. He chooses to designate her in the scene with Fury as sacred, which transforms his jealousy into love, at least temporarily, a transcendent feeling that takes him away from the hotel room and out into a gray, impalpable world, as Joyce put it earlier in the paper. Part 4, and the last part. This transformation from one pursuit to representation nears its completion at the story's end, when Gabriel begins to imaginatively, quote, set out his journey westward, end quote, and witness the snow falling over Ireland, quote, across every part of the dark central pit plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried, end quote. While tethered, obviously, to Fury's story, Gabriel's imagination is freeing itself to provide associative imagery that redirects his attention from the mimetic scene of resentment to Fury's grave and melancholic images of Bar-Ilan, Ireland he associates with his wife's former lover. Gabriel's imagination then soars beyond Fury's grave as he envisions the other, quote, crooked crosses and headstones on the spears of the little gate on the barren thorns, end quote. In the story's final line, the iconic sentence, the narrator describes Gabriel's soul as swooning, quote, slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead, end quote. Here, Gabriel has an aesthetic, romantic, and religious experience due to this feeling of solidarity he feels with Fury, nature, and seemingly all humanity. He is, as Gads would put it, experiencing an aesthetic ecstasy that, quote, derives its force from re-experiencing the birth of transcendence. Gabriel's aesthetic, end quote. Gabriel's aesthetic experience begins with envisioning Greta and Fury's last romantic encounter, and then opens to the wider world and the originary scene of the birth of the human culture by imagining the snow falling on all the living and all the dead. The comprehensiveness of Gabriel's transcendental vision is, one could argue, an expression to transform his resentment, but it is not far-fetched to presume that it serves to an end, to later redirect his energies towards strengthening his marriage. Gabriel's decision to travel westward involves mental travel, but we could also take it literally to suggest that he has decided to vacation with his wife to the west of Ireland, which until now he has refused to do. Earlier in the story, Miss Ivers accuses Gabriel of being unpatriotic by vacationing in Europe. She gives him a chance to redeem himself by inviting him and his wife to travel west for the upcoming summer. While Greta is excited by the idea, Gabriel is not. At the story's end, the narrator suggests that he is now ready to make this trip. This change of mind illustrates the idea that the representation of the originary scene does not diminish desire, can in fact help to stimulate the resolve to pursue the object with a renewed sense of purpose and a new strategy. So, to conclude, while Gabriel's first reaction to the Fury story is jealousy and anger, witnessing his wife's distress over revisiting the incident causes him to fall in love with her again, as the concluding paragraphs indicate. As mentioned, or seem to indicate. As mentioned earlier, Gabriel probably has never felt this passionately for his wife until now, ironically, when he realizes that his wife never loved him like she loved Michael Fury. From a Girardian vantage point, Gabriel's passion is mimetic, derived from Fury, who risked his health to be with Greta one last time. However, the way Gabriel channels his passion demonstrates Gans's conception of the aborted gesture of appropriation. Rather than furtively striving to get Greta to love him as intensely as she loved Michael, he can release his consciousness from the hotel scene, which links to the presumably originary scene of her romantic life. He aborts this gesture of appropriation and declares Greta and Michael to be as sacred as the geographical parts of Ireland that Irish poets and artists have lauded for centuries. Gabriel's sacralizing of the scene shows this move away from an adulthood of navigating self-consciously through erudite cosmopolitan circles in mainland Europe. By declaring both the object, Greta, and interior mediator Fury to be sacred, Gabriel can spiritually remove himself from the originary scene, at least momentarily, as from the originary scene he has constructed to take a mental journey across the country, identifying emblems of Greta, Fury, and all of Ireland.
Thank you, Martin. And we'll take questions now. All right. Questions to Martin.
We're going to wait until the second paper.
No, Marina?
Yeah, should I ask now then? Yes, Martin, thank you very much for this paper. I find your argument very convincing. You know, it's been a long time since I read that story, but you refreshed it in my mind, and I find it very convincing in like large features and details. And I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned the Epiphany in your title, and I have worked with epiphanies, do you have an originary theory of epiphany? What is it? Yeah.
I mean, in the background of my mind, whenever I was writing this, when I was writing this paper, I was thinking, okay, this is taken. This party is probably on January 6th or around it, the Epiphany, and I think subconsciously I was asking myself, is this significant, and if so, how? And I haven't pursued that, but and of course, Joyce is famous, especially early on in his writing, for his epiphanies. I mean, the Dubliners is filled with epiphanies. Every story has an epiphany. I mean, it kind of structures each story. It's a major, part of the climax. And then here we are, the last story that takes place on the Epiphany. Well, it's a sudden realization, right? There's something transcendent about having a sudden realization, I think, right? There's a
recognition. It's also you recognize something that you haven't seen before, like the shepherds and the wise kings. You know, they see something that they haven't seen before, but they recognize it. So it's a kind of a paradoxical experience of recognizing what you haven't seen before.
Yeah. Recognizing something that you haven't seen before. Yeah. I'll have to give more thought to that. I mean, the importance of the Epiphany in that. Well, there's awareness of him in this story, anyways. The Epiphany that he has is regarding his marriage, anyways. That he's on the periphery, right? He's on the periphery of his marriage, right? And there's that realization, that epiphany that he arrives at, right? But there's something that seems to be empowering about that realization. So there's kind of the paradox, or one of the ways of seeing a paradox in that situation. But I think, the Epiphany could play a more major role in my thought process as I'm developing this.
All right, more questions, Andrew?
Yeah, so thank you, Martin, for the paper. I enjoyed it a lot, and it reminded me of, I love that story, and I'm a big lover of Dubliners generally. I guess my question would be, title of the story, The Dead, and the rivalry Gabriel experiences with the dead Michael Fury. I mean, this is one of the cruel things about the story, of course. How do you fight with a dead rival? If the guy were still alive, Gabriel might have a chance to seek him out and take his baseball bat with him, but that isn't going to happen because the poor guy died. I'm wondering about, Joyce, modernism, irony, barrels of ink that have been spilt trying to pin down how to, extract the theme from the story, which isn't something that we necessarily have to do. But what would you say to the proposition that, in a way you could read the story as Gabriel transcending Michael Fury as a sexual rival by assimilating that one individual into the symbolic role of being a stand-in for all the dead of Ireland, so that, in fact, what seems to be a renunciation of violence is a kind of modernist sublimation of violence rather than some kind of victory over resentment. Have you come across an interpretation roughly like that, or what would you do with that suggestion?
Well, I haven't come across an interpretation like that. I think that's kind of the direction I'm heading in. The sublimation, the sense of peace that he's developing depends on this symbolic appropriation, right? I think in yesterday's talk, the open panel discussion, there was a conversation about what the symbolic gesture of appropriation, or the symbolic, and that's going on in the story, is symbolically appropriating everything, and but it's an act of peace by being an act of symbolic violence, I guess. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, that's fine. I was just wondering, if you played with those ideas at all. I mean, I guess what I'm suggesting is that one of the problems with the story is that the piece that Gabriel achieves doesn't feel, there's something off with it, at least for me. You're still uneasy about it. Like you wonder where Joyce is in this, and whether Joyce is actually, humiliating Gabriel rather than presenting him as a model of, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that it would be too simple, I think, to see Gabriel's tenderness as simply a kind of transcendence of the sexual rivalry.
Yeah, and I was this my inner voice as I was writing this. I was thinking, is this a little bit too positive of a reading of the ending? And that's why I was kind of inserting these little qualifiers as I was reading. Seems to be, or momentarily, and he's going because there's going to be, that seemed to be the word yesterday, oscillation. He's kind of oscillating between frustration, resentment, pursuing, and aborting. And so I think there is an uneasiness to the ending as well that I haven't been that I don't emphasize in my paper. And that is something to think about as I expand this, is to think about that uneasiness and give it a little more thought.
All right. If you have more questions, please save it to the end of this session. And now we're moving forward to the next presentation. And this is by Dominic Mitchell. And Dominic Mitchell is an independent scholar from Bristol, and his undergraduate was in humanities. He has a master's degree in computational science from Plymouth University in England in 2001, which was when he first, as he says, became fascinated with the topic of the origin and evolution of language. From 2010 to 2019, he was a part-time student in computer science at University of Bath in England, attempting to write models of the evolution of language. As he says, he now lives in Bristol, England, a city famous for building the English half of the Concorde jet plane, and more recently, to his words, for a BLM protest thrown in a statue of slave trader Edward Colston into the harbor. And now Dominic Mitchell with his presentation called Does Fornari's Ternary model improve the prospects for interdisciplinary understanding of language origin? Dominic?
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll just try to share my screen.
Great, works.
Great. Yeah.
Sorry, there's something interrupting in the presentation.
Yes. Okay. So I think to introduce the talk, I think it's fair to say that GA has made greater impact on the humanities than the sciences. And this might just be a feature of academia, or I wonder if it's something more fundamental. And when I was reading Fornari's account of evolution, it made me think that it could be something more fundamental. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the theory of why there might be a conflict between GA and science, and also give a practical example from my own work. So the structure of the talk, I'll briefly talk about Fornari's accounts, then very briefly the scientific model. I'll make my case for why there might be an incompatibility. I will say there might be some positive outcomes from this, and then I'll show a practical example, a computer model. Fornari's account, it's ternary, so as in made of 3 parts. And an example is his view of Jesus' teaching. He says it's a mistake to see these teachings as a response to Judaism, and better to see them as a response to an interaction between Judaism and pre-Socratic religion. And to see things like that depended on a kind of genius. So the last point is to make clear that Fornari doesn't want to depend on either confession or reduction in his arguments. So my reading of Fornari is that all culture is achieved by this ternary mechanism. And viewing culture this way forces us to confront the opacity in culture. There may be other accounts which say something similar, but I think why he inspired me particularly was that his account is so dense and very vivid. So I'm going to say that Fornari's model may conflict with scientific models. But first of all, I want to just check that I'm not complaining about the correctness or accuracy of scientific models. So I follow George Box's famous idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I think everyone can agree that scientific models are have been extremely successful. And to give just one example of a scientific modeler who's had great influence on me is John Maynard Smith, who looked at evolution as if it were a contest in game theory, which I think earlier speakers mentioned game theory yesterday. So why do I think it's incompatible? It's because unlike binary relationships, instances of the ternary mechanism, we can't subject them to abstraction because the specificity of the instance is the point. So if I'm right about this, there might be a problem for science when it comes to modeling language, which is, or other parts of human culture which are ternary. So might be very limited. So an example of this is, it has been shown that language conforms to the zip distribution. But we have to really ask, although this is convincing, does it really tell us much about the nature of language? And I mention here the Bar-Ilan conference series because I think the audience from the GA conference might find the Bar-Ilan discussion of language basically very limited and boring, disappointing. And I'm not trying to be flippant here. I think it's might be an outcome of this incompatibility that I'm claiming. So this could be linked to the idea that language is not fungible. I've struggled to find much discussion of this issue. Has been discussed by Brian Christian when he described his experience of taking part in the Turing test. And it could arguably, the same view could be ascribed to Wittgenstein, but I don't think he ever explicitly addressed it, or certainly didn't use the word non-fungible. What fungible means, what non-fungible means here is that if it is true that language is non-fungible, it's not one in a class of things that are like it, which just as my view of Fornari suggests, might make it difficult to deal with in science. This may have been discussed before, but to save time, I'm going to skip this slide. Could always come back to it later in questions. So if I'm right in this argument, then if scientific models of language are possible at all, they might require a kind of imaginative transformation, which you don't need for when you model another natural phenomenon, for example, a river or the flight of a bird and so on. Another consequence is that just as some researchers use the failure of AI and robotics to be truly human as an indirect way to put into relief what is human. Perhaps we could do something similar if it turns out that we can't model language. And the last theoretical point is that if there is this gulf between culture and science, the gulf itself might be a worthwhile thing to study. So that's the end of the theory part. And now I'll look at a practical example from my own work, which is a simple model of mimesis. So I will change the share screen to allow you to see the model. Can you see do you see the same screen that I'm seeing?
No, Dominic, because you shared the PDF, the Acrobat. So you need to do a new share.
Okay.
Also, don't forget to share sound and optimize for video.
Okay.
On the popping menu, at the top or the bottom, press the green button for new share.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, now we can see it.
So this is a very simple model trying to demonstrate the relationship between triangular mimesis and the focus of a population on a single point. So the triangle shapes in this green world represent individuals, and they react with each other by drawing a line from themselves to another individual. And the rule that we apply is that each individual has an object, and which is the identity of another. And to choose an object, they first choose a model, and then the model's object becomes their own object. So and when you run the program, you see how the triangular relationship, the effect it has when it's population wide. So let's so you can see that when the triangular relationships between individuals are multiplied into a population, it results in a single focus on one point. So I'd like to really evaluate this model in the terms that I was suggesting earlier in my talk. So is it imaginative? I would say not very imaginative. Does it really capture much of any of the essence of language? I'm not sure. So I think I'll finish my talk there, and hope that I've inspired you to consider this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. All right, can I close your sharing?
Yeah.
All right. Questions to Dominic, please. And
have you shown it to
Martin too?
Have you shown this to Mark Zuckerberg?
No, I haven't.
Or maybe Jeff Bezos?
No, but I have discussed this with some GA members.
Marina's got her hand up.
Yeah, Adam?
I think you said Marina had her hand up.
Doesn't matter, you can go first, Adam.
Yeah, okay. I don't really have a lot to say. I just want to, I mean, first of all, I just want to say that this looks very interesting to me. And it correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded to me like your theoretical introduction was driven by an attempt to explain why the computer model failed. At least that's the way it sounded to me. And I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, it seems to me a bit hasty to say that it failed, or that it's not imaginative, or that it's not going to show us something about language. I mean, I'm not sure where you go with that, but I mean, it does seem to be very interesting that everything converges on these single points. I mean, that does seem to kind of confirm what we'd expect from a mimetic theory. Now, I don't know where you would go from there, but I mean, I guess if all I could say is that if I could encourage you to keep working on it, and to think that there might be something more imaginative here than you've realized so far, then I would say that, because it definitely looks interesting and promising to me.
Well, thank you very much for that encouragement.
Okay. Yes, I would like to second what Adam said. I find it absolutely fascinating that they converged. And you know, a couple of months ago, I tried to look at the code of the program, and I couldn't understand it. I couldn't find what is happening, why it converges. So it's like remains a mystery whether it's something in the ether, in the electrons, because I certainly didn't see any bias in the program itself that would, you know, it would seem completely random. So, you know, we'll keep thinking, maybe take a look again. But I wanted to ask you if you could give an example. You said that instances of the ternary mechanism in operation cannot be subjected to abstraction. I found it very interesting and provocative, but could you give an example in connection to language? Like what would be a ternary mechanism in language and what couldn't be abstracted?
I don't know that I could give an example in language, but I could give an example in culture.
Sure,
which is
sure. Mm-hmm.
in recent culture, which is that, as Roman mentioned in the introduction, in my local city, they threw a statue of a slave trader into the harbor, and that divided opinion in the city, and the local museum took the statue out of the water, and they're now displaying it not on its original plinth, but in a glass case in the museum.
Oops.
And how is it? Oh, is it frozen?
Yeah.
Preserved, perfectly preserved in the statue. And so I think this is a good example of specificity that I think Fornari is talking about, which is that this museum, I think they're trapped really. Whatever they do to the statue now will be, will irritate one side or the other. And so you could say, you could put the statue back on the plinth, but you'll never be able to return the humans involved to the situation prior to the statue being thrown into the harbor. I hope that helps, and rather than, or does it make it even more confusing?
But maybe see that Adam wants to ask. So
yeah, I want to just try something else really briefly. If what you're pointing to, I mean, it's a very kind of compact and very powerful argument, actually, that for why language really can't be modeled scientifically. I mean, what happens if you reverse it and ask whether science could be modeled linguistically? I mean, science, like anything else humans do, has to be language as well. So maybe science is, you know, ternary in the same way language is, and just doesn't recognize there's a specificity to any scientific hypothesis, to any scientific experimentation or whatever. And it's also bound. I mean, we have now kind of a couple of generations of science studies pointing to the way in which science is embedded historically and socially and so on. And the norms of science don't just spring up out of some, you know, disinterested objectivity that human beings just happen to discover within themselves, but it's also a product. So if you kind of reverse it and think about modeling science through language, maybe it becomes a different kind of question.
Yes, thank you. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Yes, I will think about that.
Well, if I can jump in again, I don't want to monopolize, but they do have language math these days. I think many kids who go to school in elementary school, they have this language math approach, which sounds a little bit fishy, but yeah, so there is the scientific method, and that is if you could isolate the same situation exactly, you will always get the same result. And that in itself is these days, well, I mean, in the, you know, most cases, absolutely, but it's questionable whether it's an absolute principle, right? Because you could have like quantum effects, like you could never isolate exactly the same situation and eliminate all you know, like quantum influences and forces. So even theoretically, you probably can't, but I don't know if it relates to Ternary, but yes, so there are, I mean, and there has been a lot of opposition lately talking about, you know, like a social protest in, you know, like non-Western countries, you know, that science is a white discipline, and, you know, that it's not universal, you know, or mathematics is white. And I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not in support of this, but it certainly has been challenged that, you know, there are some scientific methods that that might not be, you know, universal truth, or maybe we should return to them and see, you know, how universal they are.
Yes, I hadn't really considered that yet. What I was thinking of so far, it's just that science has been so successful in so many things. So, but even by that standard of success, it doesn't seem to have made the same progress in the case of language.
Right. So I think we arrived to the end of this extremely interesting session. Thank you to both presenters, to Martin and to Mitch and to Dominic. And we'll take a break and see you in 8:30 for the next session. All right.